Okay, hi guys. Today we're going to discuss toy models, free body diagrams, and the debunk of climate science. And we're going to do that by queuing off of this website, skepticalscience.com, and a review they did of what I've been saying called Joseph Postman and the greenhouse effect. It's going to be quite hilarious what we see them saying in just a moment. Let's proceed to that. So I'll just cue off that initially, and then we'll discuss a few things, and then we'll come back to this to finish, because it's going to be hilarious for you when you see what this means. So Joseph Postma published an article criticizing a very simple model that nonetheless produces useful results. And this is from this ridiculous website, skepticalscience.com, which is just some crackpot alarmist website that's really ridiculous, created by some cartoonist or something like that, a person that has no qualifications in science whatsoever. Not that qualifications in science are all that meaningful these days anymore anyway. In any case, let's look at this free body diagram. Now, anyone who's had a course of physics in high school will have seen a diagram like this. This is called the free body diagram. And if you haven't had a course in physics in high school, that's all right. This little diagram is just how we tabulate forces acting on an object, and we calculate sort of the Newtonian reactions. You know, if there's a force acting on an object, then that force will cause that object to move, right? And so what we do is we just depict a square box, and this square box can be any object. It can be quite arbitrary. This box can actually be a rocket engine. It can be a whole rocket. It can be a vehicle. It can be something with 1,000 moving parts. But as long as you tabulate the forces acting on the outside of this object, you can calculate how this object is going to move. You can actually launch rockets into space around the Earth using simple diagrams just like this. So you will want to know the velocity as a function of time, and that will be a function of the forces over the mass times the time that's been elapsed. You want to know the position, and this is a very simple position equation. You want to know the position of this object as a function of time. And to know that position, you need to know its velocity. To know its velocity, you need to know its acceleration. To know its acceleration, you need to know the forces acting on the object. So if you do that, you can launch something quite precisely into orbit as long as you know what all of these values are. You want to know the force of gravity, the force of friction that's trying to retard the motion of this object, whatever thrust this body might be generating from itself or externally might be pushing on it. So it's really quite neat and quite simple, and even in high school you can use a little diagram like this. It's a very quite abstract diagram, but because you're just using a black box, a little box here, a little square to represent some object, and as long as you can calculate those forces, you can calculate exactly how that object is going to react and where it's going to go. As long as these values, of course, are real, are the real values that actually exist in reality, then you can do that. So when free body diagrams are used to model things that actually exist and to model forces that actually exist and use the laws of physics and mathematics that actually exist, then you get good mathematical solutions which allow you to actually manipulate and understand the mechanics of reality and of the object. The diagram can be quite abstract in depiction, but nevertheless models things which are real, because you're modeling forces which are real and which actually exist. Now, let's take a little stroll down astronomical and physics history to give it a little example. Of course, this is my forte in astronomy. I love this sort of stuff. So astronomers should appreciate this. The Ptolemaic model from Ptolemy in about 100 AD is when this fellow lived. Model of the solar system, for example, was geocentric. So Ptolemy, this ancient Greek scientist, created a model of the planets moving around the sky as if the Earth must be at the center of that motion. That's a fairly reasonable guess to have made, or assumption to have made back then, actually 2,000 years ago. Not at all unreasonable. Earth was at the center of the universe. To explain retrograde motion, the planets had to move upon little circles. Now, retrograde motion is just a behavior of the motion that the planets actually take when you're looking at them in the sky relative to the fixed background stars. I won't get into it. It's just a funny little backwards motion that the planets appear to make for a little while, and then they start moving forward again if you're looking at them in the sky. And that's relative to the background stars, so they'll be moving in one direction, and then for a little while they'll move backwards, and then they'll start moving forward again. So that backwards motion is called retrograde motion. So they didn't know why that really would happen back then. And so in this solar system model that Ptolemy made, which is a reasonable approximation or assumption to make, and then he had the planets moving in perfect circles about the Earth. And again, that's a pretty reasonable thing to assume back then for that time period. So we had the planets moving around the Earth in perfect circles, because why wouldn't they move in perfect circles? Why would they move in any other kind of shape? That's arbitrary. However, and that's that's something that sort of follows the principle of sufficient reason. You would make such an assumption back then. However, to explain retrograde motion, then he added these things that are called epicycles. And this is motion of the planet that goes in a circle, a smaller circle, on top of the bigger circle. So for example, Mars. Mars is going around this circle right here, around the Earth. So that's Mars. But in order to explain retrograde motion, he added a little circle that Mars follows, orbits around, on top of the big circle that it's orbiting around on the Earth. Now, at that point, they should have realized that you're no longer following the principle of sufficient reason, because what possible reason could there be for a planet moving on a little circle on top of a big circle? So at that point, they should have realized maybe there should be more generality allowed. But in any case, they had no idea what they were looking at, and still, it's not at all unreasonable that this was done, and it worked fairly well at the time. So to explain retrograde motion, the planets moved upon little circles called epicycles as they traveled around the big circle about the Earth. Now, what's really interesting about this is that this is actually rudimentary Fourier theory. This is Fourier transform theory. This is rudimentary, the first deployed example of the Fourier transform. It's actually quite fascinating. One day, everyone's going to know that this is the first deployment, the first known deployment of Fourier transform theory, of Fourier theory. A little circle, which is a frequency of motion, superimposed on top of a larger or a different frequency of motion. You're just superimposing frequencies on top of each other in order to explain, in order to see the components of the motion. Really quite neat. Okay, in any case, Copernicus used, so everybody thinks that Copernicus placed the sun at the center of the solar system. Well, he kind of did, but he didn't actually change the mechanics. Copernicus used the exact same model as Ptolemy. It's the exact same thing. All he did was change the reference point to the sun, but he still had epicycles, and it still had the exact same observational errors and problems. Yeah, so the thing about this is that it worked well. This model worked well for the precision of your eyeballs, looking at stars and planets on the sky. But when we started developing telescopes and we could measure things more precisely, then we could see that there were errors in the predicted positions versus the observed positions. So there was something wrong with our model. They could tell something was wrong with it, or it needed some improvement in any case, because the predictions from this model, from the mathematics of this model, were not actually corresponding with what was observed. So Copernicus did nothing to actually help that problem, because all Copernicus did was use the exact same model, just transformed the center to the sun instead of from the Earth. Otherwise, the planets were still on perfect circles, orbiting perfect circles, and they still had epicycles and whatnot. So it didn't really make a difference. And Ptolemy likely already knew of the possibility of writing his model out this way, because it's an obvious and easy thing to do. And Ptolemy was certainly smart enough and intelligent enough to understand that that could be done. So maybe Ptolemy already knew about that. It's not known, but he probably did. So in any case, that's astronomical history. So along comes Kepler, and it was Kepler who actually postulated that the sun is at the center of the solar system, but as a physical force. It produces a physical force which actually governs the movement of the planets. So the sun is now a governing body instead of just an arbitrary point in space. The sun is now a governing body. And Kepler introduced some generality into the shape of the orbits, that they could be ellipses rather than them having to be perfect circles. And so this actually marks the beginning of modern physics as we know it. It's this event, it's Kepler that actually produced the beginning of modern physics. And then Newton came after that, and everything else basically came from this development from Kepler rather than from Copernicus. So now, with Kepler's model, now the model matched what actually physically and mathematically exists. So this is what exists. The planets do move around ellipses. The sun is the center of the solar system as a governing body through the force of gravity, obviously. And the same equations are used today for putting rockets into orbit quite precisely. So now you have the mathematics for what actually exists. So you actually have an ontological mathematics for orbital motion, which matches what actually exists, and therefore the equations match the predictions, and the observations match the predictions from the equations, and so now you have an ontological mathematics that actually represents and reflects what actually physically exists. So let's look at the pseudoscientific rebuttals of my work from skepticalscience.com. So let's not forget, and let's remember that the foundation of climate science is based in these diagrams, these flat Earth diagrams. Okay, so what did they say? Joseph Postma published an article criticizing a very simple model that nonetheless produces useful results. Oh, okay, really? Is that what happened? Oh, does it produce useful results? And they also said, you're criticizing a toy model that is only used to teach the basic concepts. Oh, okay, so talk about self-incrimination. I mean, this is a joke. So their toy model and their basic concepts and their useful results from this model are what? That the sun doesn't heat the earth, that the sun doesn't create or sustain the climate, that the atmosphere produces twice the heating power of the sun through reverse heat flow and heat recycling, which is in violation of thermodynamics. Heat flows from cold to hot, with a special exception to the laws of thermodynamics for radiation, even though it's all the same thing as we've discussed in my last video, and the laws of thermodynamics tabulate no special exception for radiation. And what is it? It is literally flat Earth theory as modern physics. It's flat Earth theory developed into a mathematical model. So it's fiction. So, I mean, this is sophistry. This is how sophistical arguments work. I mean, this is the perfect example of sophistry. You point out the flaw in their thinking, and then they say, you're only pointing out a flaw in my thinking. It doesn't count for anything. And it's like, that's exactly the point. So do you see how sophistry works? Sophistry just says the most stupid and ridiculous things. I mean, that's how it works. You just say the most stupid and ridiculous things, and you get away with it. I mean, that's the world we live in. You just say ridiculously stupid and retarded things, and you get money and get away with it. That's the way our world has always worked, hasn't it? If you look at the history of the religion and whatnot. So I published an article that criticized a very simple model that nonetheless they say produces useful results. And I was only criticizing a toy model that's used to teach the basic concepts. Yes, I grant that to you. I grant that to you, that those are your basic concepts. And I grant that to you, that those are your quote-unquote useful results. They're not useful, but those are your results. I grant that to you entirely. And what are your results? And what is your starting point for understanding the climate? So their starting point for understanding the climate is that the sun doesn't create it, and that it's the atmosphere that creates the climate within itself by recycling heat several times over, by producing twice as much heat as the sun, even though there's no identifiable release of heat in the atmosphere. There's no combustion taking place, there's no fusion, power being released. It just magically does it. Heat flows from cold to hot. Okay, and it's flat Earth theory is modern physics. So good work, guys. Really good work. I mean, that's a really good. This is the quality of their rebuttal, guys. This is the quality of their rebuttal to what I'm pointing out, right? And when I submit it to peer review, all they can do is just say, we're not going to allow you to publish that because it fatally undermines our whole position here, right? What fraud? Disgusting freaks. So don't model fiction. Here's a principle that we should learn going forward in physics and in science. You think scientists would ever appreciate this? Don't model fiction? They obviously don't even have the ability to comprehend, or they do, and they just purposefully ignore it because they want to model fiction, because that's their racket. So what do we need to appreciate about this model, this flat Earth model that they have of the climate? It's simple. Just like Ptolemy's system, which did not produce useful results, because it doesn't exist, right? It does not exist. What Ptolemy said about the epicycles, about the planets moving on small circles on top of big circles, that does not physically exist. That is not what physically occurs. It is not how planets move. And that is just the same thing as here. This does not exist. This does not represent anything that does exist, and modeling this only results in things that do not exist. So this Earth as an entire flat plane, that does not exist. Incoming solar radiation, as if it's minus 18 degrees Celsius, which is this equation right here, that does not exist. That does not exist. The minus 18C solar input does not exist. That is not what physically exists. A minus 18C solar input from the sun is not what exists. A flat Earth is not what exists. Yet they model that and they extrapolate from that, and therefore what do you create? They create this heat recycling, heat flow from cold to hot, greenhouse effect. And of course, does that exist? No, it of course does not exist either, because it's coming from something that doesn't exist. It's founded in something that doesn't exist. And if you simply refer to the laws of thermodynamics, as we've done multiple times in my videos, heat cannot flow from cold to hot, nor can it be recycled, right? So just in comparison to this, which is, even though this is completely abstract, this can exist, this free body diagram here, it can represent something that exists, and modeling this results in things that do exist, if, that is, you're using forces that actually exist. This minus 18C solar input, as if that's the input to a flat plane, that does not exist. So for example here, if you were modeling a rocket and you needed to know how many newtons of thrust the rocket was producing, but you just divide it by 4, like they do over here. You just divide the thrust of the rocket engine by 4 because you're averaging it over its lifetime. Instead of when it's burning, you're just averaging it to when the rocket engine isn't working, isn't producing thrust, and you divide it by 4. Well, how is this thing, is your model then going to predict what actually happens? If your model says the force of thrust of the rocket is 1/4 what it actually is, then when you predict the position and the velocity of the rocket, is it going to be what the rocket actually does when the rocket is actually at full thrust, not at a quarter thrust in your model? You model the rocket as at quarter thrust, but the model actually takes off at full thrust. Well, what is your model going to do? Is it going to be consistent with what's actually observed? Of course not. Guys, God. Do you see how stupid this is that I got to explain this? And anyone that's normal, anyone who's watching my videos and watches my videos regularly, I know you all get this, implicitly understand. I have to frickin' explain this. I have to explain this to PhDs in physics, to PhDs in astronomy and astrophysics, to PhDs in climatology. I have to explain this like I'm explaining it to a frickin' donkey, right? I don't even have to explain this to my 7-year-old daughter. I didn't even have to explain it to her when she was 3. You don't have to explain it to kids. Even kids understand this. This is what you have to explain to a donkey. I'm writing these frickin' videos for donkeys. And of course, do donkeys get it? Of course donkeys don't get it. And they just keep doing what they're already doing. Good God. This is our expert class, people. This is our expert class. That's why you should not trust the experts anymore. All these people that are pushing vaccines and drugs and lockdowns and this and that, you can't listen to them. Do not listen to them. These people all believe in flat earth theory. They all believe in climate. Anyone who believes in climate alarm in this day and age still believes in it, global warming. You cannot trust anything that they say. You just can't trust the expert class anymore. Which is fine, because we should be sovereign. You know, you should have a sovereign mind and figure things out yourself, and always criticize and look at, follow the money. Always look at who's trying to scam what. These people are just scammers. They're donkeys. I mean, they pretend to be donkeys, but they're actually probably quite intelligent, and they know precisely how they're lying. They know precisely that they're in a war with us to be parasitical. Their mode of existence is to be parasites. And so they know precisely that they are parasites, and that they're figuring out how to parasitize off us. And so what do you need to do to a parasite? So here's a useful quote, actually. Physics is a function of the impulse of the moment. That's when and how physics occurs, and that is the only physics occurring at any time ever. In the moment. We live in the moment of now, and that is when physics is occurring. What they do here is they say that this is a 24-hour average. It's like, okay, well, that's great, but the 24-hour average of sunlight is not what physically exists. Minus 18, they form that 24-hour average and then say that that's what the input is. No, that's not actually the input. That's not actually the real-time input. Physics, reality, reacts to the impulse of the moment, to what is happening now, in situ, in a location, in the moment of now. At a specific location, in the moment of now, is what occurs at that location and in the moment of now, by tabulating all the forces acting on that location in the moment. Okay, this average over 24 hours means nothing. They call this the energy balance diagram, but this does not exist, because this does not exist in real time. It doesn't exist at any time. It's a complete fiction. And we saw what it produces. Sun doesn't heat the earth or create the weather. Atmosphere produces twice the heating power of the sun. Heat flows from cold to hot. Their output is reversed for input. See, look at this in my diagram, which we'll discuss a little bit more deeply here in a moment. See, here's the actual output when you calculate it the right way. Here is the output. It's that same equation, C, F, 1 minus A over 4. That's right there. That's the output of the Earth. And the Earth is quite cool, minus 18 degrees Celsius on average. That's the Earth's average temperature. It's radiation temperature. They use that output as the solar input, as if the solar input is minus 18 degrees Celsius on a flat plane. Okay, so if you actually try to predict, or try to depict, a reasonable model that captures the energy budget, the thermodynamic energy budget of the Earth, then you come up with something like this. And here you depict the solar input as it actually is, as it actually exists. The solar input as it actually exists in real time is quite warm, 121 degrees Celsius on a black body. That is hot as heck. It is powerful enough to send lakes worth of water into the stratosphere to 30,000 feet with cumulonimbus clouds. It is powerful enough to send small lakes worth of water to 30,000 feet. That's how strong sunlight is. Okay, you cannot do that with their input, with their solar input of minus 18 degrees Celsius. You would never generate a cumulonimbus cloud. You would never generate anything above minus 18 degrees Celsius. You would never generate even liquid water, for example. So with this model, you would see right away by looking at the numbers that, oh wow, this is going to generate the Hadley cell, and it's going to generate the heat flow from the equator to the poles. And oh wow, what is that heat flow? That heat flow is the climate. All of that heat flow is rain, snow, wind, everything else. It's everything, okay? And the Earth is obviously rotating beneath that warm input. And you can also throw in here that there should be an adiabatic gradient so that the bottom of the atmosphere is warmest, and you can see that I shaded that red. So the bottom of the atmosphere is warmest. The top of the atmosphere has to be coolest due to this adiabatic gradient. The average temperature then of the atmosphere, since the atmosphere has depth, obviously then has to be in the middle of the atmosphere. The average cannot be at the bottom of the atmosphere. The average cannot be at the top of the atmosphere. The average has to be around the middle of the atmosphere. And what is that average? That average is the effective radiative temperature of the Earth. So everything works out, and there's no need to postulate this reverse heat flow, heat from cold to hot greenhouse effect, where it's carbon dioxide that creates the climate. And they think we need to be afraid of that, because if there's more carbon dioxide, then more climate is going to be created, and having more climate is bad in their theory, in their parasitical little scheme. So of course this is all over peer-reviewed science and all over our physics classrooms, and this gets rejected from peer-reviewed science. I cannot publish in peer-reviewed literature the concept that the sun heats the earth. Think about that, guys. That's what I published. That's what I attempted to publish a couple of times now. The first time I recounted the story in my first book, In the Cold Light of Day. And then the second time you've seen in a video from last year about the AMS. They will not allow the scientific field, the field of physics, the field of science, will not allow publication of a paper which says that the sun heats the earth. We're dealing with donkeys. A lot of these people are donkeys. Like, I said they're not all donkeys at their parasites. No, a lot of these people are actually donkeys. Like a lot of these physicists who are incapable of understanding this, they are actually donkeys. They are as dumb as donkeys. They're as dumb as a bag of rocks, and they literally cannot understand the difference. They cannot understand the meaning of the difference in the words in saying the sun heats the earth versus the sun does not heat the earth. They're literally, it would be like saying that to a donkey. Hi, donkey, the sun heats the earth. Choose. Hi, donkey, choose. Does the sun heat the earth or does the sun not heat the earth? And the donkey will just sit there and bay at you a little bit. I mean, that's what you get from these people baying. They come into my office and they bay at me like a donkey, And I say to them, does the sun heat the earth or does it not heat the earth? And then they just bay like a donkey would bay because they don't understand the meaning of the words. So a lot of these people are donkeys that believe in climate alarm and believe in flat earth theory, that have PhDs in physics. They are donkeys and as dumb as donkeys. But I think higher up at some level, there is some sort of parasitical force which knows precisely what they are doing. And they know precisely how they're lying and sophizing and just creating some sort of ridiculous, retarded racket by which they can create some, insane, insane system that they're trying to create. So anyway, I think that's it. Don't model fiction. This does not exist. This flat Earth diagram with minus 18C solar input, that does not exist. It's not what exists. You have to be as dumb as a donkey to believe that's what exists. And they are as dumb as donkeys because they say, you're just criticizing our donkey model. That doesn't mean anything. And it's like, yeah, but you just said you think that it produces useful results. And you said you're using it to teach the basic concepts. You're saying that you're using the basic concepts from it. And they say, well, yes, that is what we're doing. As if that's a rebuttal. God's sakes. Okay. I think that's it. Hopefully, yeah, half an hour. All right. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.